Welcome to episode 39 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and today we're going to talk about Sonny Rollins' 1958 album Freedom Suite. And what I have here is not the 1958 original pressing. I have the 2014 Original Jazz Classics. This originally came out on Riverside, and Original Jazz Classics is a series which has basically been reissuing both Riverside and Prestige jazz albums from the 50s and early 60s for some time. So this is a trio. Rollins sort of comes into jazz, so obviously as a teenager he's learning his instrument. He switches from alto to tenor sax because he was increasingly keen on bebop and particularly on Coleman Hawkins, who was really his idol growing up. It's because of Hawkins that he switches to tenor. By the mid to late 50s, he was already cutting records as a leader. He was working with people like Art Taylor, Kenny Drew, Jackie McLean, Miles Davis, Bud Powell, and he'd previously experimented with a jazz trio, a pianoless trio, so basically just drums, bass, sax, on Way Out West, which is also a great album, which kind of a quirky album, which I recommend you listen to. But this is a whole other step forward, and again, some of the musicians I mentioned there are really quite politically, at the time, were politically, socially aware and astute, as I don't think you could avoid being if you were an African-American person and you saw what was happening around you. But they were also committed as musicians, or many of them, to finding a way to articulate their discontent and their anger, what was happening around them in their music. And Rollins, that clearly rubs off on Rollins. And he decides that this is the time to actually make a statement. And this is really one of the earliest big political statements which is made in a jazz record. That kind of thing became normal by the mid-1960s and explicit by the late 60s and early 70s with the addition of lyrics and so on. But this was new territory in 1958, and all the more remarkable, therefore, that Rollins chose to do this. He took a break pretty shortly after this record, saying, I was getting famous at the time. I felt I needed to brush up on my craft, and essentially implying that that too much was happening too fast, and he didn't really feel he was earning, the success he'd accomplished. And he would take multiple breaks in his career along these lines, which was it's kind of a unique feature of the way he approached life. It's also an interesting album because of the liner notes, strangely enough. So liner notes are kind of a political thing in jazz because it was very normal for all the way through the 50s and a long way into the 60s as well. If you pick up any jazz album from, say, 1957, what you're going to find is this is 58, but 50s. You're going to find some interesting cover art, but on the back you're going to find an extended set of liner notes, which are invariably written not by the musicians themselves, but by either the producers or the owner of the label or well-known jazz critics, all of whom were white, and the players were almost all, well, in many cases, African American, and so there was this kind of thing happening where white people were interpreting what black people were meaning in their music, which maybe was less problematic, when the music was about music per se. But as the music became more political, and as the circumstances in the United States became more fraught, it becomes a little more questionable as to why this practice is occurring, and eventually black artists would rebel against this. Miles Davis in particular rebelled against the liner notes in the back being written by somebody else, and also the practice of, doesn't happen here, but in so many cases of sticking a white woman's photograph on the front cover of an album played by black musicians. And he made it a point to put black people on the covers of his albums going forward, himself, his partners, and so on. But this album is interesting in this regard because the theme of the music is very much about civil rights, very much about resistance to oppression. And Orrin Keepnews, who's the producer of this record, writes the liner notes. And the liner notes kind of go out of their way to suggest that really this is about sort of personal freedom and sort of musical emancipation and so on, and not about the murder of Emmett Till or any of the other or Little Rock or any of the other outrages. There's also a quote from Rollins, which is on the back cover, which I'll just put a photograph of here, and that quote, there was a lot of talk about Keepnews himself sort of presenting himself as the author of that quote as opposed to Rollins. Now, I think, Keepnews was an enormous promoter of black musicians. I think it's reasonable to take a charitable view of this and say he was probably in his own mind feeling he was protecting Rollins from Rollins being too political and being attacked by his either metaphorically or otherwise by recipients of that message, but Rollins wasn't having it, and he wanted his name on it, and there it is. And really the surprising thing is why Rollins' messaging isn't all the messaging on the back of the album, and why Keepnews kind of slaloming and navigating of the social issues and the issues around racism is what dominates the all of the text. So again, side one is just the Freedom Suite. It's basically it's in three movements. Rollins starts off with this very sort of simple, repeated melody. He's got that great sort of fat tenor tone of his, which is so unmistakable. He's playing with Oscar Pettiford and with Max Roach here as well. Pettiford, who played with Duke, and Roach, who himself would go on to do a very significant protest piece in the Freedom Now suite. Which comes out just 2 or so years later. It's shockingly long in 1958 to have like a 19-minute plus track, and in part this is Rollins, speaking about about the sheer length and duration of the experience of oppression for Black Americans. There's all kinds of different aspects to this. It's a track that this whole track is the one you want to come back to again and again. My personal favorite is the middle part, where Pettiford's bass it feels to me like like the tension that he's conveying. It's almost like he's pacing the floor in anxiety or anger or something. At least that's always what I hear when I hear it. Needless to say, Rollins' playing is great. It's varied. It's extraordinarily expressive all the way through. It's and the other thing to note is a remarkable symbiosis, very similar to Bill Evans' trio, where there was so much real connection between the players. Pettiford, Roach, and Rollins achieve this kind of feeling where it really is hard to tell where the soloing starts and the accompaniment stops. They play off each other so well. Rollins finds a way all the way through to kind of find his way back to the melody one way or another. It stays exciting all the way through. This is a song, a jazz track that you just want to play it again when you're finished the first side. But there is another side. I would say it's competent. It's full of standards, Tin Pan Alley songs. It's got a song by Noel Coward. Which starts it, which is Someday I'll Find You. That has nice soloing from Pettiford in particular. It has this little duel at the end between Rollins and Roach, which is kind of fun. The next song, Will You Still Be Mine? It takes a while to get into it, but then Rollins, when he really digs in, it's really quite a wild ride. That whole song. The third song is Till There Was You, which is a Meredith Willson song, which the Beatles also covered the same year. Let's just say it's a lovely melodic song. It's very different from the passion of the of side one. And then the album concludes with Shadow Waltz, which I think is the least memorable song on the whole album. I don't get the sense that Rollins ever really gets to grips with it, frankly. And like I say, it's, you know, you hear it once, you don't really feel compelled to hear it again. My verdict on this album, I give it a 4 out of 5. The first side is an absolute landmark, and you'll want to hear that again and again. You might listen to the second side once or twice, but you'll always come back to the first side. It's a remarkable record, a great testament to the early musical and also emotional and political maturity of a great artist.